So one thing must say is that there is never a boring day in supply chain,
Mhm.
and my 20 years of experience kind of proves that. Keep the customer front and center, keep the user experience front and center. Think about the feature sets that the customers would need. The answer to AI, as an illustration,
Yeah.
is not to be more robotic; it's to be more human.
Welcome, everyone, to the VSERVE Ebusiness Solution podcast on supply chain management, where we invite some of the industry's great experts to share their experiences and gather some helpful tips along the way. I'm your host, Cynthia, and today we're diving deep into the world of, high stakes global supply chain management with a leader who has navigated some of the most complex industries as far as I know. So, thank you so much, Venkatesh Srinivasan. Did I say it correctly?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining, Venkatesh. Currently, you are the VP of Global Supply Chain at Diamond Foundry, and you have over 2 decades worth of experience in the Silicon Valley's most innovative sectors, right? So, I was reading through your profile. It was automotive, customer, consumer tech. You have semiconductors, climate tech, and you worked with Cummins as one of the companies. I think they're scaling about 1.2 billion worth of business units there. And I was reading through and I saw you were a big producer or contributor to a product like MacBook at Apple, and you were at June as well. So currently, you are one of the most trusted advisor in the C-suite and boards, and you're specializing in high performing teams. Really humbled for having you in my podcast today, and yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was high praise, and that was a great introduction.
And I
I'm not
still
sure
didn't
if I
cover.
deserve all of it.
Yeah, and I still didn't cover half of your profile. But I do want to, address this before I start the podcast. That every view that is expressed today by Venkatesh is going to be his professional, personal insights. So I'm ready to get started. Can we go along and start asking you all about where it started? How did you, end up in a global supply chain industry, and we just love to get the first question out of the way. Is give us a bit about your professional journey.
That's great. So, firstly, Cynthia and the VSERVE team, thank you for having me on board. I'm happy to share my personal journey, and hopefully that's useful for your audience. So, you said it already, but I'll just reiterate again. Of course, all views are in my personal capacity. So, going back to, I think your question was, which was how did I get started in supply chain, right? I'm an engineer by training, and my career evolved when I moved to the US. So I had my undergrad degree in industrial engineering in India, and then I moved to the US nearly
Mhm.
about 20 years back to do my master's in the same field. And it was almost serendipity, almost honestly, that I found myself in supply chain. My first job out of college, out of grad school, was as of a supply chain SQE, so the supply chain quality engineer.
Mhm.
So I was responsible at a company called Cummins, you're right. And so I was responsible for the quality stuff of very critical auto components. And and I did that for a few years, and it was fantastic. But slowly, it felt like a bit of a checklist job, and I wanted more action in my life, if you will. So I moved to a business unit at Cummins, which was quite small then, and wasn't at that point wasn't quite profitable, and it was only about 200 million in revenue. So I joined that business unit, and I changed my career. I moved from the quality aspect of things of supply chain to commercial aspects. So I was responsible now for supply chain at large of some critical commodities. It was a very fortunate decision because while I was there for the next 5 years, we grew, the business unit's revenue grew from about 200 million to about 1.2, 1.5 billion, something like that. So it was really fortunate timing for me, and it felt like a good decision in hindsight. But that was a fantastic learning opportunity, scaling supply chains from reasonable nascency to high scale. dealing with suppliers all around the world, the top suppliers all around the world. And right after that, I moved to. I was recruited to be in Apple, so I was there for a few years at Apple as part of their MacBook team, and then thereafter it's been a series of startups. And you're right, I'm currently the VP of Supply Chain at Diamond Foundry. It's my third startup, and enjoying every day of it. So one thing I must say is that there is never a boring day in supply chain,
Mhm.
and my 20 years of experience kind of proves that.
Yeah. And I've heard that from everyone. Like supply chain is always like it brings you new surprises every day. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from you. And I know I want to start with one thing that I read was I'm not sure, is it called VUCA? VUCA framework?
VUCA, that's right.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
I would love to hear more about it. I know you've mentioned it a lot of times in your profile, but how do you structure that strategy to handle things like say geopolitics or macroeconomics? How does that framework help
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start off with. So for the audience who are unaware of the acronym VUCA, so this is an acronym that came about over the last. I think it traces its origins back to U.S. military or U.S. strategic think tanks, uh, close to about a decade back. And VUCA is an acronym. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this is a shortcut to define or to illustrate what the world is and how it appears to be today, right? So you see volatility all the time. There's a lot of uncertainty. Uh, Supply chains are complex. They're global, and there is really no, it's very ambiguous. It changes all the time, right? So it's especially in the last 20 odd years, if you look back and you will see that the history of the way the geopolitics has shaped the world that we are living in has made it quite challenging to do business. Technologies have shifted dramatically. So many things have structurally changed. Some things making harder, some things being made very easy, right? So I think that's structuring your supply chain in the VUCA world is really going to be the hallmark of success for any supply chain leader going forward, right? And and to answer your question more directly, Cynthia, uh, I find that it is better to not focus on the headline events, right? So if you turn on Bloomberg or CNBC day in day out, the headline is three or four things: geopolitics, macroeconomics, monetary policy, and things of that nature, right? These things are quite out of our control, right? So I much rather advise all the companies, on my team as well as different companies that I meet and advise that it's most important to number one focus in defining and influencing the key things that we can influence, right? Keep the customer front and center, keep the user experience front and center, think about the feature sets that the customers would need, make engineering choices based on those feature sets, and think of the financial metrics that your company needs. It's after all, we are here to make money and advance our financial goals, right? So think of those things front and center. The rest that falls out of it or comes through that, right? Once you defined all these things, curate your supply chain around it, right? Which would be your distribution channels, your warehousing strategy, figuring out your demand profile for your customers, and understanding what the manufacturing constraints are for the product you're trying to manufacture. Now, this could be the feature sets of the product, or this could be where the supply chains are located for this kind of manufacturing. It could be any of it, right? But you start with influencing what you can influence, then you move on to curating what you can curate, and then the next step is you model for things. So you simulate for the edge cases, right? You simulate for your currency market fluctuations, your metal market fluctuations, your legal IP risks, your transit time and lead time, kind of the more mundane issues, right? But if you focus on all these things, once you influence, you curate it, you simulate it, I think you're well prepared, right? So no matter what the world changes or does to you, right? you're well prepared to respond to it, and you coming in well prepared, having thought through what's most important for your customer, and how you're going to deliver that, right? So I think the best solution in the VUCA world is just to stay focused. And I will also say the other thing, which is to stay connected, right? um, the answer to AI as an illustration,
Yeah.
is not to be more robotic; it's to be more human,
Yeah.
right? Kind of paraphrasing what I've heard from so many of the global experts, but I think those things have will go a long way in navigating through this world.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me to the next, question or the topic is the global complexity of it all, right? Like, even if we're looking at the challenges of scaling across, like, say, Asia, Europe, US, simultaneously in most of the times, how does that strategy change depending on now with the age of technology and AI? How does that support?
Good question, and I'll reflect on my experience. So my experience takes me working with suppliers in Europe, Asia, and of course in the US. And what I've discovered, Cynthia, is that obviously a lot of region to region variation,
Hmm.
and it depends on the strength of each of these regions, and it also depends on the products that you trying to manufacture in these regions, right? So, as an illustration, it still holds true that it's quite easier to manufacture automotive in Europe or large parts of southern US, because the
Hmm.
ecosystem of large manufacturers is kind of built out over there. So if you're trying to scale, let's just say consumer or durable or a consumer electronic product in those regions, it's going to be much harder, right? There are geographies in China, especially in southern China, which are purely built around scaling consumer goods, right?
Hmm.
Anything that you use in your household, from your washing machines to your TV sets, to anything that has 5 to 7 year time frame. Many of them are manufactured in Zhongshan or Dongguan, in China, right? So, and what you witness in those cities is that not only are they assembling those widgets over there, but they're also deeply integrated into the ecosystem there. So they're the sheet metal work, the tooling work that powers that sheet metal work or what have you, right? All of that has gotten kind of really integrated into that ecosystem, right? And if you look at semiconductor, for example, I mean, you have to be in the region of Taiwan, right? Or you have to produce from there, and of course in the U.S. in Arizona. So I think it just depends you how you pivot your supply chain and manufacturing strategy, and it depends highly on the region of your operation and the product that you're trying to produce.
Perfect. And when we're talking about, say, the hierarchy of everything, right? So, supporting breakthrough, especially for tech industries like semiconductors, EV materials. I think you've worked extensively with that. There's a paradigm that you use as well. I think it was called. There are four things to it, like define, curate, stimulate, adapt, something like that. So, how do you use that to balance, the speed, the cost, the resilience? That was a little fascinating when I was hearing about it. So I would love to hear a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think it's a bit of a further application of the kind of paradigm, the model that illustrated while answering one of the questions earlier about VUCA world, right? So I think it goes back to the basics, right, of product development strategy, and embedding your supply chain through the product development strategy, right? So supply chain, the argument I make is supply chain should not be a standalone function, as it often is in many companies and often involved at a later stage, right? The best impact that any supply chain leader or any group could have is early on, right? So, so first things first is you have to define what you want, and those definition can come about on different vectors, right? Your financial vectors, your end user customer vectors, the consumer experience, the feature sets, the engineering choices. All of that is the basic definition bundle, right? Move on from there to the curation bundle. where you're curating your supply chain strategy well around it. Third one, simulating the edge cases. Fourth one, with geopolitical situations, you just adapt to the changes, right? So that's the basic paradigm, right? Now, you mentioned about speed and cost, and that's critical, right? And regardless of the kind of breakthrough technologies we're looking at, whether it's semiconductor or EV, I think one thing that stands out is time to market, right? Which is measured by how quickly can you move from idea concept to an idea to a prototype to a working product to a scaled working product, right? That's this whole life cycle through which the product goes through. And my north star has always been keep the product first, keep quality high, make sure there is speed, right?
Yeah.
Supply chain personnel, we're often told about how to get the costs down, and it's absolutely essential.
Mm.
I spend many hours in a day just figuring how to get costs down. But I think once you get the product to the market, once
Yeah.
you ensure there is good product market fit, once you're able to illustrate that, or once you're able to do that in a very short period of time, you can always work around. There always find ways of reducing cost, and then you develop what I call as resilience, right?
Hmm.
So supply chain resilience is the hot buzzword right now, especially what's happening with the global trade challenges.
Yeah.
So I think that's the pecking order. You index for product and speed, then you figure out cost, and then you figure out resilience.
Wow. So when you put that into like a success story, I guess, how would you? I would love to hear an example of that kind of playing out, if you have any for us, or that one that you can share.
Yeah. So I'm going to share a story about a product we launched about maybe a few years back, 5 or 6 years back, right? So
Mhm.
I'm going to give you an older story, but it's still very relevant.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It was a story from my first time I worked at a startup. I moved from a large, big tech company, Apple, to a small startup, um, and we were making consumer products. So we were making a smart oven. So it's basically a hot box with a bunch of sensors rigged in it with cameras in it. We were using NVIDIA chips back in the day. I'm talking about nearly 7, 8, 10 years back. And, we're doing computer vision. We're figuring out how's the food being cooked, counting food and a whole variety of things, right?
Yeah.
Actually, it turned out that the first gen of the product, which was launched right around when I joined the company, didn't quite do well. It had a variety of issues, including cost, right? And it was on me to figure out, along with others, but from a manufacturing perspective, it was on me to figure out how do we make it work.
Yeah.
And by making it work, it meant how do we launch the next gen product at half the cost, at in no time, basically, right? So I kind of used this same model, right? Thinking through what are the things that we need to do. So the first thing we figured out is, let's redesign this. Let's figure out what feature sets are super important for the customer.
Hmm.
Let's leave out the other feature sets. um, and so let's deliver what's truly what our customer wants. So we focused on that. Then we moved the supply chain. So we moved our supply chain from North China to South China, which is where all the ecosystem was. And we got considerable, and we consolidated a supply chain under under a few suppliers versus multiple suppliers, right? So by consolidation and by feature elimination and feature consolidation as well, we were able to create a product very quickly at a very low cost, right? I'm talking about roughly 30, 40% cheaper, right? uh, but you think through the next step, which is curating the supply chain, but also simulating for the edge cases, right? So I think this is a real life example where I would say we did a reasonable job for simulating for a variety of things, but we never anticipated that that would be such a big tariff shock. And I'm talking about 2018, when there was the first
Yeah.
25% or so tariffs on imports from China.
Yeah.
So our whole supply chain was in China, uh, and I told my team that we got to get out of this region of operation. So what we did was we kept producing in China and we start working on a third product. And this time repeated the playbook, define the product even better, remove the superfluous features, improve for quality,
Mhm.
curate the supply chain. And we moved out of China to Turkey, and we integrated a supply chain under everything under one roof. We found a supplier who was an outstanding supplier for us, and we made all of that happen. So eventually, at the end of this 4-year, 3-year journey, we were able to cut cost. I'm going to say nearly 60%, and and still deliver a high quality product, and preserve all the features that our customer wanted. So I think it's just a simple playbook that you
Yeah.
should just be. They often say the main thing is to keep the main thing,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
and that's what we did. We kept those. We focused and we executed.
Wow. And that's like such a perfect example to kind of talk about how globally you can grow if you kind of come out of that one shock that you get in the beginning, right? So and it's been so fascinating seeing such kind of unique ways the trade power has moved from some global techs, some global giants, I guess, to the other world. So it's fascinating to hear success stories like that. And how do you think like AI and advanced analytics play a part in this? Like, how do you think they append the way we drive alignment, say across these cross-functional teams and traits?
Yeah. So I mean, first thing I tell people is AI is here to stay. I mean, we've seen the explosion of that happen
Yeah.
over the last 3 years in particular.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were simpler formats or rudimentary formats of AI even earlier, right?
Yeah.
A lot of machine learning,
Yeah.
but I think the neo formulation of AI has really taken off and captured the imagination of everybody,
Yeah.
right? Um, Look, I see the adoption of AI very similar to the adoption of cell phones or you know uh, smartphones, I guess,
Yeah.
back in 2007, launch of iPhone, or even before that, the adoption of PCs and compute and software that goes on top of that, right? So I think it's very similar. I think it's almost going to be an imperative to adopt it, because if you don't adopt it, it's obvious that your competitors are going to beat you to the market, right? And they're going to beat you to market on a few dimensions, right? They're going to be lower cost operators. They're going to have less headcounts. They're going to be the time to market is going to be much faster. The from ideation to execution is that time frame is going to be super small. And then they're going to use advanced analytics to make sure that they don't deviate from what their robotics and automation. They're going to embed AI on top of all of that. So they're going to beat you to market. So I think so. Being here in the Bay Area, in the Silicon Valley, you witness every day how companies are doing this, how startups are bringing solutions to life. So I want to illustrate maybe two examples. So obviously, both these examples are from companies that I'm kind of advising, their C leadership and help them think through the challenges.
Hmm.
So I think one example, for example, of a company called Trucko. It's
Hmm.
Trucko.ai, and what Trucko does is that it's basically purchasing automation, right? So automating a variety of your work streams,
Hmm.
uh, and automatically figuring out the work that needs to be done and populating what's next on your to-do list in the form of a dashboard, right?
Yeah.
So the AI would work on top of the data that your company generates, which could be emails, Slack chats, G chats, and what have you. So
Hmm.
that uses that as training model, and then every day in the morning, if I'm a supply chain professional, I need to figure out, hey, in a fast changing environment, what are the key tasks that I have. I go to my dashboard and it's automatically, without reading emails, it's out there. You got to create POs for a whole bunch of these suppliers. there's a quality metrics that's not going well for another supplier. So it figures out what needs to be done. It creates these templates, and basically it gets your ball rolling, right? So that's a beautiful example of reducing that time to market. So that's one illustration. The other illustration is another fascinating company I'm working with, and it's called Autumn Labs. And I was recently with the CEO, and he was just illustrating, how his AI, which is basically it's sits on top of uh, the actual machines manufacturing the widgets you're manufacturing overseas. So it's embedding AI into the equipment, the machine doing the manufacturing, potentially overseas or also within your factory locally. But what it does is that it gathers a whole bunch of data, critical data, which is important for manufacturing, like how much is the output, what's the cycle time, what's the yield, um, if there is a production breakdown, and so on and so forth, and then they generate alerts, right? So combination of that is like running a virtual factory. So it allows you to focus on the right things and predict where deviations are coming ahead of time and solve for it, right? So in real life it saves cost, because you're not paying cost for bad quality product. You're catching these deviations in advance. You're not missing your shipments uh, because it's fast, because giving you a very good view of how much your daily production rates are per machine, and you can go and target the machines which are not doing well. So I think those are kind of two illustrative stories that just come top of mind.
And that's perfect, right? So it's the way you kind of, like you said, the playbook, the way you scale, the way you work those things. And I think that's kind of like where I wanted to kind of point towards next, was the manufacturing aspect of it, because there's a paradigm there as well, that you use to help you kind of re-architect global sourcing, footprints. So um, can you tell us a little bit more about how you've learned, staying agile in those industries?
Yeah, I think I'm going to index back on some of my kind of favorite playbooks, if you will. But I think it's one thing I tell people is, if you're looking global manufacturing,
Mhm.
you got to be always on site, right? So visiting suppliers, even though we every day I talk to my suppliers on WhatsApp like every day.
Yeah,
There's no substitution for on-site visits. So
yeah.
I think always be on site is kind of one big thing, when I always say, like especially in global manufacturing. So get ready to travel. I think that's one rule of thumb I have.
Mhm.
The other, often I get asked this question is, what's the paradigm for reducing cost? How's the paradigm for launching products and so on and so forth? Specifically on reducing costs, right? Again, going back to the things, right? Number one is you eliminate something I call eliminate, consolidate, negotiate, automate, manage, right? So right, it kind of follows that trend and has a nice ring to it, right? But you eliminate things that you don't need to, which are purely superfluous. You eliminate them. You consolidate things, features, or supply chain. Get multiple things under one, because you get because either you're eliminating superfluous features, or you're driving more efficiencies, right? So you eliminate, you consolidate. After that, you negotiate with the supplier and say whatever you need to negotiate, you negotiate. On top of that, once you're done with that, you layer on, you figure out through negotiation what your rub points are, what the hard points are for the suppliers, where the cost drivers are. Use automation to reduce those, eliminate those rub points, right? And after that, it's pure management, it's pure execution, it's pure staying on top. Just circling back to what I said, which is always be on site, right? So management means always be on site, talking to the suppliers. Um, if your supply chain is in Asia, or for me, being here in the US, then always talking to them in the evenings, catching up with them in the morning if there are production disruptions and so on and so forth. So always stay connected, right? So I think that's a simple paradigm, nothing complicated, but it's just a discipline to execute it.
Yeah. And then where do you see, I'm pretty sure like most of these areas you can also, kind of make yourself sparse by using offshore, right? Like offshoring your support. But with new tariffs and trade agreements that you're seeing nowadays, where do you really see these offshoring adding, most value today, or future, I guess?
Yeah, I think one aspect of global tariffs, at least so far, is that the tariffs are applied on goods and not on services, right?
Yeah,
So I think when it comes to offshoring, which is moving your cost centers overseas, it's going to be hard to do that increasingly with goods, right? So manufacturing goods, unless you have structural issues in the country of
hmm,
operation. For
yeah,
example, if um, if if you live, simple example, right? So if you live closer to the poles, right, and you want to eat bananas, you can't grow bananas locally
yeah,
unless you grow them in a greenhouse, right? So you
yeah,
got to get them from an overseas location, right?
yeah,
So similarly, there are many manufacturing constraints where sometimes those supply chains are not available in that country of operation. You can develop it, and that's going to take time, and it's possible.
yeah,
But it's going to be challenging, right? So I think the easier thing to do when it comes to offshoring is services, because as things stand today, that there are limited to no tariffs applicable on services,
yeah,
and services come in different hues. You think of HR services, accounting services, engineering services, design services, testing services. And I can list out a whole variety of them, right?
yeah,
So I think services is where I will index on if when it comes to offshoring.
yeah,
But I think another aspect of that, right? And many people think of offshoring primarily as BPOs, which is kind of back office
yeah,
call centers, if you think, right?
yeah,
And but I think there's much more to it, right? So increasingly, you will see that an illustration is that for a lot of the tech giants around the world are
yeah,
setting up these GCAs, global capacity GCCs, I think global capacity centers
yeah,
in all around the world, especially like low cost regions. Could
yeah,
be Poland, it could be India, it could be South America. You know, could be Philippines,
yeah,
English speaking, predominantly regions with high tech skills
yeah,
are very well suited for that. So and what the advantages it offers is that your office never sleeps. As you turn off the lights here in the US, you're
yeah.
turning it on in India. And again, going back to the theme I had, which is time to market, right? So you can really, really reduce, really shrink that time to market.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's perfectly put. And I know we're coming like towards the end of the time and I have so many more things to ask you. But before I let you go, I guess I always ask this question is what is that, final piece of advice, that number one advice that you have, kind of worked through your professional journey, especially to professionals now in this changing market, to business owners who are designing supply chain for long-term innovations, what would that one piece of advice be from your end?
I'm going to say keep it simple, right? I'm going to keep it simple. I will say be curious, be in the data, be deep in the data, uh, be brave, adapt new technologies, and prepare, right? Prepare for this volatile world, prepare for this VUCA world, right? So, yeah, I think that's something I tell myself every day, and I'm sure it'll find use for others as well.
That was a perfect podcast, Venkatesh. Thank you so much. I know, like, I've read about these paradigms when I was learning about supply chain, but to kind of get that refresher and actually see it being used in the real world. Like when we were reading this, it's like, do we really use this? I mean, every company has their own things, but the way you kind of talk about supply chain, not just being as a back office function, but more like a core engine for innovation and competitive advantage. I love that. So it was a good class for me to kind of work on my supply chain, and kind of like the innovation world. But thank you so much for your time. Do you have any last thoughts, any last words before we end the podcast today?
No, I just want to end it by thanking you for giving me this opportunity. I hope your audience finds this useful, and thank you for your time.
Same here, Venkatesh. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're really busy traveling, but thank you so much for your time. And I know it's super early for you, so still having that thought of process. It was amazing. Thank you, and it was great talking to you. You have a good day.
All right, thank you.